The year is 1356 AD. In a small stone chamber above her father's bakery in the French village of Montclair, 16-year-old Elena stands trembling in her thin linen shift. The autumn wind rattles the wooden shutters as her new husband, Guillaume, a blacksmith nearly twice her age, removes his leather jerkin with deliberate slowness. The smell of forged smoke still clings to his weathered hands. Below them, she can hear the raucous laughter of wedding guests, drunk on ale and wine, waiting for the proof that will seal this union in blood and honor. Elena's mother had whispered warnings in her ear just hours before. Submit, child. It is God's will and your duty. The pain will pass, but your soul's salvation depends on your obedience. The words echo in her mind as Guillaume approaches, his eyes reflecting the flickering candle flame. This is not a love story. This is survival in an age where a woman's body belonged first to her father, then to her husband, and always to God. Welcome to medieval Europe, where sexuality was a battlefield fought between the flesh and the spirit, where the most intimate moments of human life were governed by rules so complex and contradictory that even married couples could damn their souls through the wrong touch, the wrong position, or the wrong day of the week. In Elena's world, there was no privacy, no personal choice, and certainly no concept of sexual rights as we understand them today. The chamber door creaks as Guillaume latches it shut. Outside, his friends begin their vigil, banging pots and singing crude songs that will continue until they hear the sounds that confirm the marriage's consummation. This ritual, known as the bedding ceremony, was not mere celebration, but legal necessity. Without proof of consummation, the marriage could be annulled, leaving Elena's family in disgrace and financial ruin. But before Guillaume even touches his young bride, we must understand that this moment carries the weight of centuries of religious doctrine, medical ignorance, and social control that would seem utterly alien to modern minds. The Catholic Church, the supreme authority in medieval Europe, had developed an intricate theology of sexuality that governed every aspect of intimate life. According to church teaching, sexual intercourse even between married couples was inherently sinful, a necessary evil for procreation that must be carefully regulated to prevent the corruption of the soul. Saint Jerome, writing in the 4th century but still quoted by medieval priests, declared that a man who loves his wife too ardently is an adulterer. This wasn't metaphorical language, it was literal doctrine that shaped how Elena and Guillaume were expected to conduct their most private moments. The great theologian Thomas Aquinas had codified these beliefs in his Summa Theologica, creating a detailed manual of sexual conduct that priests would use to interrogate married couples. During confession, as Guillaume's calloused fingers reach for the leather ties of Elena's shift, both newlyweds know they are being watched not just by their earthly community, but by the invisible eyes of saints and angels who would judge their every movement. According to church law, they could only engage in sexual intercourse on certain days of the week, never on Sundays, Wednesdays, or Fridays, never during the 40 days of Lent, never during Advent, never on feast days or fast days. When scholars calculated all these restrictions, married couples were left with approximately 50 days per year when sexual intercourse was not considered sinful. Even on permitted days, the rules continued. Only one position was allowed: man on top, woman beneath, face to face. This missionary position wasn't just preferred, it was the only position that wouldn't condemn their souls to eternal damnation. Any deviation was considered against nature and therefore an abomination in God's eyes. Oral sex was forbidden entirely, as was any position that put the woman on top, which violated the divine order of male dominance. Elena had learned these rules from her mother, who had learned them from the village priest during the humiliating process of confession. Medieval confession wasn't the private affair we might imagine. Priests were trained to ask explicit questions about sexual practices, frequency of intercourse, and physical sensations experienced during sex. The church had developed detailed questionnaires for different categories of penitents, with married women facing the most invasive inquiries about their intimate lives. The medical understanding that shaped Elena's world was equally bizarre and terrifying. Medieval physicians, following ancient Greek and Roman texts, believed that women were essentially defective men. Female sexual organs were thought to be male organs turned inside out. The vagina was an inverted penis. The ovaries were internal. Testicles. This wasn't mere ignorance, but established medical doctrine taught in the universities of Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. These beliefs had profound consequences for how medieval people understood female sexuality and fertility. The physician Constantine the African, whose works were still studied in Elena's time, taught that women required prolonged stimulation and multiple climaxes to conceive. This led to the tragic medical belief that rape couldn't result in pregnancy because the woman couldn't achieve the necessary pleasure for conception. If a woman became pregnant after sexual assault, medieval courts often interpreted this as evidence that she had enjoyed the experience and was therefore partially responsible for her own violation. Elena's mother had also warned her about the wandering womb, a condition that medieval physicians believed could cause hysteria, madness, and even death. They thought the uterus could literally move around inside a woman's body, traveling upward to strangle her heart or downward to escape through her vagina. Treatments included fumigating the vagina with pleasant scents to lure the womb back into place or applying foul-smelling substances to the nose to drive it downward. But alongside the church's official doctrine and physicians' theories, there existed a shadow world of folk knowledge passed down through generations of women. In the forests surrounding Elena's village, wise women gathered herbs under the full moon, maintaining ancient knowledge that the church condemned as witchcraft. Pennyroyal and tansy could be brewed into teas that prevented pregnancy, though the dosage between contraception and death was perilously thin. Mandrake root, shaped like a human figure, was worn as an amulet against the skin to increase fertility and was so valuable that carved bryony roots were commonly sold as forgeries. In medieval markets, these practices existed in a dangerous gray area between medicine and magic. A woman might pray to Saint Margaret for safe childbirth, while simultaneously burying a piece of afterbirth under her threshold to ensure future fertility. She might wear a crucifix to church while hiding a piece of amber between her breasts to prevent miscarriage. The line between acceptable folk medicine and condemned witchcraft was impossibly blurred, and constantly shifting. Medieval contraception was a desperate gamble with death. Women were taught to jump backwards 7 times after intercourse to prevent conception, or to drink wine mixed with ground bees. More dangerous were potions made from mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that often killed the woman along with any potential pregnancy. The consequences of unwanted pregnancy were severe in a world without reliable contraception. Women faced constant threat of death in childbirth, with maternal mortality rates reaching 1 in 3 births. For unmarried women, pregnancy meant social destruction, exile, or death. The practice of infanticide, while officially condemned by the church, was widely understood as a desperate woman's last resort when faced with impossible circumstances. Village communities developed elaborate systems of willful blindness, allowing them to ignore what they couldn't officially acknowledge. But let us return to Elena's chamber, where her wedding night represents far more than the union of 2 individuals. Medieval marriages were military alliances, economic mergers, and political statements all rolled into one. When Elena's father negotiated her marriage to Guillaume, her virginity was literally her dowry, more valuable than gold or livestock. The hymen became a currency of honor, traded between families as proof of their daughter's purity and their own reputation. The pressure on young brides was enormous. The wedding guests waiting outside Elena's door weren't merely celebrating. They were serving as legal witnesses to the consummation that would make the marriage binding. The bloodied sheets would be displayed as proof that the bride was indeed a virgin and that the marriage was legitimate. If no blood appeared, the bride could be returned to her family in disgrace, branded as a whore, or even killed for fraud. Some desperate brides would secretly prick their fingers or hide chicken blood to fake the evidence their new families demanded. This deception was incredibly dangerous. Discovery could result in accusations of witchcraft or fraud, punishable by death. But medieval understanding of virginity was hopelessly flawed. They believed the hymen was a solid membrane that completely blocked the vaginal opening, rather than the partial, flexible tissue it actually is. They thought its absence was absolute proof of sexual activity, when in fact it could be torn by horseback riding, heavy lifting, or natural anatomical variation. The Church's doctrine of consummation created its own bizarre legal practices. A marriage wasn't considered valid until sexual intercourse had occurred, which meant that proving or disproving consummation became a matter of legal inquiry in church courts. These courts would examine both husband and wife, interviewing them separately about intimate details of their wedding night. They would inspect the woman's body for signs of penetration and question neighbors about what they had heard through the walls. Guillaume finally approaches Elena, and she notices how his breathing has changed, becoming heavier and more urgent. The scent of ale on his breath mingles with the smoke from his forge that seems permanently embedded in his skin. She has been told to submit, to endure, to think of her duty to God and family. But what she hasn't been told is that even this moment of submission could damn her soul if conducted improperly. Medieval people lived in terror of sexual demons that were believed to prey on humans. During their most vulnerable moments, the succubus and incubus weren't folklore, they were accepted medical and theological facts. Church authorities taught that these demons could take human form to seduce men and women, stealing their life force through sexual intercourse, and using stolen seed to create demonic offspring. The succubus, a female demon who seduced men, was blamed for nocturnal emissions, sexual dreams, and any sexual thoughts that occurred outside the narrow bounds of marital duty. Medieval theologians developed elaborate theories about how these demons operated, believing that a demon could first take female form to collect semen from a man, then transform into male form to impregnate a woman with the stolen seed. Any child born from such a union was believed to be cursed or possess supernatural powers. The incubus posed an even greater threat to women like Elena. These male demons were said to be physically stronger than humans and capable of overpowering their victims, women who reported sexual dreams or experiences they couldn't explain, were often accused of consorting with demons willingly. The line between victim and witch was terrifyingly thin, and accusations could destroy not just the woman but her entire family. Sleep paralysis, now understood as a neurological phenomenon, was interpreted as demonic sexual assault. Men and women who woke unable to move, often with the sensation of pressure on their chest, were believed to be under demonic attack. The Church prescribed elaborate rituals of exorcism and purification, but many suspected victims were simply burned as witches instead. As Guillaume's hands move to untie Elena's shift, she feels the rough calluses from years of working metal and wonders if these same hands have ever been gentle. Medieval marriage manuals, available only to the wealthy and educated, actually provided detailed advice about the importance of female pleasure for conception. But this knowledge rarely filtered down to the common people, who learned about sex through whispered conversations, crude jokes, and bitter experience. The medical texts of Elena's time were filled with bizarre theories about sexual compatibility, based on astrological signs, bodily humors, and physical characteristics. Medieval physicians believed that sexual pleasure and fertility depended on the proper balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors in both partners. A hot husband might be incompatible with a cold wife, leading to sexual dysfunction and infertility. Physical examination of potential spouses was common among wealthy families. Physicians would examine the bride's body for signs of her sexual temperament. Wide hips indicated fertility, while narrow hips suggested barrenness. The groom's penis size and shape were analyzed for compatibility with his intended bride. These examinations were conducted with the same clinical detachment used for examining livestock. The Church had developed its own theories about sexual compatibility based on spiritual, rather than physical characteristics. They taught that couples who were too closely related either by blood or spiritual kinship would be cursed with sexual dysfunction and monstrous children. The complex rules of consanguinity meant that many medieval marriages were later annulled when previously unknown family connections were discovered. Elena's sexual reputation had been carefully guarded throughout her adolescence, but now it would be defined by this single night. Medieval sexuality was deeply intertwined with concepts of honor, shame, and social standing. A man's sexual prowess was directly linked to his reputation as a warrior, and leader impotence wasn't just a personal failing, but a public humiliation that could destroy a man's standing in his community. For women, sexual reputation was even more fragile. The slightest hint of impropriety could destroy a woman's marriage prospects and her family's honor. Medieval towns were small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. A woman seen talking to a man who wasn't her husband or relative could be branded as a whore. The standards of female behavior were so restrictive that even married women lived in constant fear of gossip and accusation. The legal system reflected these sexual anxieties in its treatment of rape, adultery, and sexual assault. Rape was defined not as a crime against the woman, but as a crime against the male who owned her father, husband, or lord. The punishment for rape varied dramatically depending on the social status of both victim and perpetrator. A nobleman who raped a peasant woman might pay a small fine, while a peasant who raped a noble woman would face torture and death. Adultery was punished even more severely, but only for women. A married woman who had sex with any man other than her husband could be killed by her husband, with no legal consequences. Medieval law codes specifically granted husbands the right to murder adulterous wives and their lovers if caught in the act. Men, however, were generally free to have sex with unmarried women, prostitutes, or their own servants without legal consequences. The sounds from outside Elena's chamber grow quieter as the night progresses, but the watching doesn't end. Medieval communities had developed elaborate systems of sexual surveillance that extended far beyond the wedding night. Neighbors were expected to report unusual noises, suspicious meetings, or any behavior that suggested improper sexual conduct. The rise of the Inquisition in the 13th century had brought new levels of sexual persecution and surveillance. Suspected heretics were tortured into confessing not only their religious beliefs, but also their sexual practices. The interrogation manuals used by inquisitors included detailed questions about sexual positions, frequency of intercourse, and even the physical sensations experienced during sex. Medieval prisons included special punishments for sexual crimes that were designed to terrorize entire communities into compliance. Women convicted of adultery might be imprisoned in cages so small they couldn't stand upright, fed only bread and water until they died of starvation. Men convicted of rape might be castrated publicly before being hanged. These extreme punishments served not just to punish the guilty, but to remind everyone of the consequences of sexual transgression. Yet despite all these restrictions and terrors, medieval people found ways to pursue pleasure and express their sexuality. The fabliaux comic tales popular in medieval France describe sexual encounters that would have scandalized church authorities. These stories, often told by traveling minstrels in taverns and market squares, reveal a shadow world where couples experimented with forbidden practices despite the threat of eternal damnation. The French poet Andreas Capellanus, writing around 1184 AD, described elaborate courtship rituals that included detailed instructions for sexual positions and techniques. His work suggests that among the nobility, there was sophisticated understanding of sexual pleasure that went far beyond the church's restrictive teachings. However, these practices were dangerous secrets. Discovery could mean excommunication, exile, or death. The tradition of courtly love, popularized in troubadour poetry, created a parallel world where sexual desire was elevated to a spiritual quest. These romantic ideals were primarily literary fantasy enjoyed by the nobility, but they had profound effects on how medieval people understood the relationship between love and sexuality. The courtly love tradition taught that true love could only exist outside of marriage. A knight's devotion to his lady was supposed to remain eternally unfulfilled, existing in a state of constant yearning that purified the soul through suffering. This created a bizarre split in medieval culture between marital sexuality, which was purely functional, and romantic love, which was purely spiritual. The reality was that most marriages, like Elena's, were arranged for economic and political reasons with little regard for personal compatibility or attraction. Among the peasantry, Courtship practices were more pragmatic, but still heavily regulated. Young people might have some choice in marriage partners, but economic considerations always took precedence over personal preference. A village girl might favor the blacksmith's son, but if the miller offered better terms to her father, she would find herself married to a man she barely knew. Some medieval engagement practices included rituals designed to test the compatibility of potential spouses while maintaining religious propriety. In some regions, engaged couples were allowed to sleep together clothed, separated by a wooden board called a bundling board. This practice allowed families to evaluate whether the couple was physically compatible, without risking pregnancy or violating church doctrine about premarital sex. The celebration of May Day retained strong sexual overtones despite church attempts to suppress it. Young people would spend the night in the forest, ostensibly gathering flowers and branches to decorate the village. In reality, May Day was an opportunity for sexual experimentation and courtship outside the normal restrictions of village life. Many pregnancies were calculated to result from May Day encounters, leading to a surge in February births that village record keepers carefully avoided documenting. Wedding celebrations included numerous fertility rituals designed to ensure the couple's reproductive success. The bride might be showered with grain or nuts to encourage pregnancy. The marriage bed would be blessed with holy water, but also secretly prepared with herbs and charms believed to enhance fertility. These practices represented desperate attempts to control reproduction in a world where infant mortality was devastating and family survival depended on producing healthy children. The medieval understanding of conception was a bizarre blend of Aristotelian philosophy, Christian doctrine, and folk wisdom. Medieval physicians believed that both men and women produced seed that combined during intercourse to create new life. They taught that female orgasm was necessary for conception, leading to the tragic belief that women who became pregnant after rape must have enjoyed the experience. Medieval people developed elaborate theories about how to influence the sex of unborn children. They believed that conception, during certain phases of the moon, would produce male children, while others would result in females. The position of the stars at the moment of conception was thought to influence not only the child's sex but also its personality and future prospects. The understanding of menstruation was rooted in terror and superstition that would persist for centuries beyond the medieval period. Menstrual blood was believed to be poisonous, so toxic that it could kill crops, sour wine, and cause men to lose their virility. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, whose works were still studied in medieval universities, claimed that menstrual blood could drive dogs mad and cause knives to lose their sharpness. Women during their monthly cycles were considered dangerous pollutants who must be isolated from normal society. They couldn't enter churches, prepare food, or touch sacred objects. In many villages, menstruating women were required to live in special huts outside the community until their bleeding stopped. The church taught that menstruation was God's punishment for Eve's original sin, making every monthly cycle a reminder of feminine shame and guilt. The lack of understanding about menstruation created bizarre and dangerous medical practices. Physicians believed that menstrual blood that wasn't properly expelled from the body would accumulate and poison a woman from within. They prescribed bloodletting, purging, and other harmful treatments to balance the female humors. Some doctors recommended sexual intercourse as a cure for menstrual disorders, believing that male seed could neutralize the toxic effects of menstrual blood. Medieval women developed their own secret knowledge about managing their cycles, knowledge that was carefully hidden from male physicians and church authorities, who might condemn it as witchcraft. They used moss, cloth rags, and sheepskin as primitive menstrual protection. They tracked their cycles by lunar phases and developed herbal remedies to ease cramps and regulate their flow. This knowledge was passed down through generations of women in whispered conversations and coded references. The medieval period saw the development of a complex relationship between official sexual morality and the reality of human desire. Medieval brothels were both legal and illegal simultaneously. The church officially condemned prostitution, but secular authorities often licensed and regulated it. Medieval cities maintained official red light districts where prostitutes worked under government supervision. These women were required to wear distinctive clothing to mark their profession, live in designated areas, and submit to regular medical examinations. The regulations varied by city, but prostitutes were generally forbidden from wearing certain colors, fabrics, or jewelry that might allow them to pass as respectable women. They were often required to work only during certain hours and were prohibited from soliciting customers near churches or schools. The church's attitude toward prostitution was contradictory and hypocritical. While officially condemning the practice, many church authorities acknowledged it as a necessary evil that prevented worse sins, like adultery or homosexuality. St. Augustine had argued that removing prostitution from society would lead to greater sexual chaos, and this reasoning was used to justify the continuation of regulated prostitution. Throughout the medieval period, medieval prostitutes came from all social backgrounds, though most were driven to the profession by economic desperation. Widows without family support, unmarried mothers, and women who had lost their reputations through sexual scandal often had few alternatives for survival. The profession was dangerous. Violence from customers was common, and the constant threat of disease made the average lifespan of a prostitute significantly shorter than other women. The regulation of sexuality extended into every aspect of medieval life through elaborate systems of punishment and public humiliation. Sexual crimes were often punished in ways designed to destroy not just the individual, but their entire family's social standing. Women convicted of adultery might be forced to walk through town wearing only a sheet, carrying a candle, while the community pelted them with garbage and insults. The practice of rough music or charivari allowed communities to police sexual behavior through organized public shaming. When couples violated community standards, perhaps by remarrying too quickly after widowhood, or when an older man married a much younger woman, the community would gather outside their home with pots, pans, and musical instruments, creating a cacophony that could last for days. These public humiliation rituals served multiple purposes. They reinforced community sexual norms, provided entertainment, and offered a way for social tensions to be released through approved channels. The targets of these rituals were carefully chosen to represent types of sexual behavior that the community wanted to discourage without challenging the fundamental power structures that governed medieval society. The medieval period produced a vast literature of sexual advice and instruction, though most of it was hidden from ordinary people. Medical texts included detailed descriptions of sexual positions and techniques, but these were available only to educated physicians and wealthy patrons who could afford private libraries. The average medieval person learned about sex through whispered conversations, folk songs, and the bitter experience of trial and error. The church produced its own sexual literature, but it was primarily concerned with cataloging sins rather than providing positive guidance. Penitential manuals listed hundreds of sexual practices, with their corresponding penances. These texts reveal a fascination with sexual detail that contradicts the Church's official position on celibacy and purity. Priests were required to ask detailed questions about sexual practices during confession, creating a vast archive of intimate information about medieval sexual behavior. Marriage manuals written for wealthy patrons provide glimpses into the sexual lives of the nobility that were hidden from public view. These texts offered advice on everything from wedding night techniques to managing sexual relationships during pregnancy. They reveal sophisticated understanding of sexual pleasure that was carefully concealed from the general population, but clearly practiced by those who could afford privacy and discretion. The medieval period saw the development of increasingly elaborate methods of sexual control that extended far beyond legal punishment. The chastity belt, though probably less common than popular culture suggests, represents the extreme measures some medieval people took to control female sexuality. These devices were not just physical restraints, but symbols of the terror that surrounded female sexual autonomy. The economics of medieval sexuality created complex relationships between sexual practice and social class. The sexual privileges of the nobility were part of their broader pattern of social domination. Lords and ladies had access to private chambers, exotic foods, and leisure time that allowed them to explore sexual pleasure in ways that were impossible for peasants living in one-room cottages with their children and livestock. Wealthy medieval people could afford to break sexual rules because they had the resources to manage the consequences. They could pay for private physicians, obtain exotic contraceptives, and even purchase religious dispensations for sexual practices that would damn a peasant's soul. The medieval church was notoriously corrupt, and wealthy sinners could often buy their way out of spiritual consequences through generous donations and strategic political alliances. The sexual double standard that governed medieval society was enforced most harshly on poor women, who had the fewest resources to protect themselves from the consequences of sexual transgression. A peasant woman accused of adultery faced death or exile, while a noble lady might simply be sent to a convent until the scandal died down. Medieval marriage was ultimately about survival rather than love or sexual satisfaction. In a world where life expectancy was short and infant mortality was high, the primary purpose of marriage was to produce children who could carry on the family name and work the land. Sexual pleasure was a secondary consideration at best, and often seen as a dangerous distraction from more important concerns. As dawn breaks over Montclair, Elena lies beside her new husband, staring at the rough wooden beams of the ceiling. The sounds from outside have long since died away. The marriage has been consummated. The witnesses satisfied, the social contract sealed. But Elena knows that this is not an ending, but a beginning of a life governed by rules. She barely understands, in a world where her body, her desires, and her very soul belong to others. The bloodied sheet will be displayed this morning as proof of her virtue and Guillaume's virility. The community will celebrate the successful completion of another marriage alliance. But Elena will carry forward into her new life the weight of centuries of sexual anxiety, religious terror, and social control that made medieval intimacy a constant negotiation between desire and damnation. The medieval period reminds us that human sexuality has always been shaped by power, fear, and social control. The bizarre practices and beliefs of medieval people seem alien to us now, but they emerge from the same fundamental human needs and desires that drive sexual behavior in every era. Understanding medieval sexuality helps us recognize how our own sexual culture reflects the power structures and social anxieties of our time. Medieval intimacy was never truly intimate. It was always public, always political, always dangerous. The bedroom was a battlefield where souls were won and lost, where family honor was defended or destroyed, where the most private moments of human life were governed by rules that seemed designed to eliminate pleasure and maximize control. Yet, the medieval period also reveals the incredible resilience of human sexual desire. Despite centuries of religious persecution, social surveillance, and legal punishment, medieval people found ways to pursue love, pleasure, and intimate connection. Their stories remind us that sexuality is one of the most fundamental aspects of human experience, too powerful to be completely controlled by any system of authority. No matter how comprehensive or brutal. The strange and often disturbing sexual practices of medieval Europe were not simply the result of ignorance or superstition. They emerged from a complex interaction of religious doctrine, social structure, economic necessity, and genuine human need. Understanding these practices helps us appreciate both how far we have come and how many of the same underlying tensions continue to shape human sexuality today. In the end, the medieval period teaches us that sexuality is always political, always dangerous, and always essential to human experience. The intimate practices of medieval people were their attempts to navigate the eternal tensions between desire and control, pleasure and danger, love and survival. Their struggles remind us that the quest for sexual freedom and authentic intimacy is not a modern invention, but an ancient human aspiration that transcends any particular historical moment. Elena's story continues beyond this single night as she learns to navigate the complex world of medieval marriage, motherhood, and survival. But in her trembling hands and Guillaume's calloused fingers, we have seen the collision of an entire civilization's sexual anxieties and desires played out in the most intimate space imaginable. Yet never truly private, never truly safe, never truly free from the watching eyes of a world determined to control the uncontrollable force of human sexual desire.